Sharing this thing. Ready? Yes. All right, do you get a microphone out? Is it okay if I do this public comment? Check the microphone. Brian's right there. Yeah. Very good. Check. Sound check, sound check.
That's a sound.
Okay.
That's like, I don't know.
Kind of muted.
All right, so we will go and get this. You good? All right, so we'll go and get the meeting going. Good afternoon. I'm Russ Grace. I'm the Chief Operations Officer for the city. I'll help facilitate the meeting. Let's do a quick roll call. Counselor Broadman. Here. Counselor Mendez. Here. Counselor Norris.
Here.
So today we have three items on the agenda, which I'll go into a little bit more detail as we introduce each item. One is around our growth management's work plan for both the climate friendly and equitable communities, as well as kind of looking forward into the UGB. Give you an update on the Greenwood Avenue project that's going on in Midtown. And then we'll also have a discussion around street standards and speed limits. Speed limits specifically was a follow-up from a council request from Councilor Mendez. Before we do that, though, we think we have a couple people for public comment, so I'll turn that over to Councilor Broadman.
I have 3 people signed up for public comment. You'll have 2 minutes. Please come up to the podium when I call your name. And we'll start with Sue Jensen.
Hi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We had a visit from, can't remember his name, this gentleman over here about the Franklin bikeway that's going to eventually be put in. And it was a great meeting. He was very receptive to all the comments that we had. And I would just like to say, Franklin's full of trees. We'd like to keep as many trees as possible. And if trees needed to be added into the plan to keep that feeling, I'm all for it. I've been living on Franklin for 20 years and hopefully we'll live on Franklin for another 20 years. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sue.
Thank you.
Ariana?
Thank you.
Hi.
I want to piggyback on what Sue said. I also live on Franklin. And it's really important to us to keep the character of the street. We're really excited about bike lanes and safer bike lanes and raised bike lanes. And I really wanted to advocate for maybe adding the street please if we can, because everybody I've talked to on our street is really worried about too much asphalt and concrete. And there's mixed feelings about bike lanes, but I just wanted to put it out there that that's really important to us. Thanks.
Thank you. And James.
We have 13 minutes. Hi, I'm James Teeter. I'm a Bend resident. I'm here to speak about our standards and specifications. I advocate for equitable and active Bend that is more like a park than it is like a parking lot. To create a city full of life and plants and humans, we require shifts in our density. This is density in housing, but also density in our transportation system. If we think about multifamily housing, this directly correlates to transit and bikes. It's a question of how many people fit in the space. But we cannot lose sight of our values of green-blue infrastructure and planning for plants and stormwater, and making sure that our street specifications consider all of these values in addition to needing to move cars. So how do we create a vast network of local streets and redefine their intent from moving and storing vehicles to creating spaces for children to play and move, and also for plants to grow? How do we revise our high-speed congested roads to prioritize people and trees? Our street standards are the governing documents that define the way that our future right-of-way will look like. In private development, these standards are simply copy and pasted into civil engineering plans. I would like to request that our city councilors take bold action and align our values with our street standards so that we can welcome housing abundance in a more livable city. I would like to request the following: 20 miles an hour maximum on 90% of our streets. Eliminating unsignalized bike pedestrian crossings of 2 vehicle lanes headed the same direction. We should define bus priority transit routes where we have these 2 lanes, i.e. Third and Greenwood, and tie them into our climate friendly equitable planning. For our collectors and arterials, we should require protected intersections and protected roundabouts. We should require raised crossings over all local streets along our arterials and collectors. We should require bike lanes at least be buffered, if not in new build, buffered by planting strips.
Thanks, James. Can you send us the rest of it via email? Thanks so much. So maybe we have one more public commenter, otherwise it's the last call for public comments. Scott, are you gonna have the
I was
time?
gonna
Go, why don't you just say that?
Am I up?
Yeah, you're up.
All right, I'll have some scattered comments for you then.
2 minutes.
All right. That's time to put my hair up. Thanks for taking the time for comments. I wanted to comment on the standards and specs and speed agenda item with a few different hats. First, I kind of want to put my TBOC hat on a little bit as a member of TBOC, not speaking for the committee. We've had enough projects come up now and over again. We spend a lot of time and a lot of money moving these projects into a more balanced multimodal type nature. The standards and specs are really the starting point for consultants. They're the starting point for private development. And so it would be, I think we'd save a lot of time and money having a robust conversation around standards and specs so that those initial designs can be more in line with what we're seeing the community wants. We can save a lot of time and money so that, our transportation professionals can move forward efficiently and on budget with producing something that the community really wants to see. It's a really all-encompassing type issue. There are housing considerations. Putting my YIMBY hat on for a moment, I can cite numerous examples where our excessive right-of-ways have killed housing units. Across the street from me, there's some apartment homes that were proposed, and between the initial proposal and the refined proposal, about 20 units were lost. And speaking just with the developer, I was wondering, hey, why did these buildings get eliminated? Well, the city wants 20 feet more of right-of-way on this minor arterial, so we'd have to do tuck-in parking, and it's just too expensive. So when I think about all of the effort and thought and energy we put into getting another 20 housing units, maybe from some city-owned property, whereas we're not really using our right-of-ways efficiently. And the worst part of it is the 20 feet of right-of-way is going to be an island, and I doubt that 20 feet the city gets from that one developer. When we go and finally redo Northeast 8th and 9th Street, where this proposed project was on, are we really going to be buying 20 feet of right of way from the hundreds of other property owners to, build this to a higher right of way spec? There's a number of, wants and needs and desires and things from a personal standpoint that feel uncomfortable for me with our standards and specs. I'm sick of looking over my shoulder, signaling, trying to thread the needle with a cargo bike with a toddler. It might be going around a roundabout. It's the only time I almost fell. Some cities all of our event
Thanks,
more
Scott.
comfortable.
Will you send
Thank you.
us any comments in email? We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Any other public comment? All right, thanks. I'll move to approve the February 28th meeting minutes.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Russ or
Yep.
Brian, do you want to kick us off?
I will kick us off. So welcome our growth management team. They're going to go over, there's a lot of things that have happened over the course of the last 6 months to a year regarding what's going on at the state level, as well as some court cases that were swirling around the climate and friendly equitable communities. I know we've talked about that a lot in that rulemaking process. All those court cases have been decided. It is being withheld. It's being held up. So they weren't denied. So CFEC is in place. What we'd like to do today is have our growth management team kind of walk through their work plan over the next couple of years. And you're seeing a preview, the subcommittee seeing a preview of a presentation that's going to be presented to council on July 17th at a work session as part of that quarterly update. So really, this is a time to have a more informal conversation with the 3 counselors on the subcommittee and our growth management team about the information that they're presenting. And also if there are additional things or requests that you would like us to bring forward to council when we bring this back in July, we'd also like to hear this feedback. But it's really setting up the plan for definitely the next couple of years, looking out 20 years, potentially looking out much further than that. So what's going to be happening over the next several years that Brian and the team will be talking about, it will have a significant impact on how Bend feels and grows over the next couple of decades. So with that, Brian, turn it over to you.
Sure. Good afternoon. So folks, there's some handouts. I hope we have enough. If folks are interested, there's a hard copy there. There'll be a hard copy at your place there, counselors, for a couple slides, further in the slide deck where it just did not seem, very civilized to be, providing this much detail on a PowerPoint slide. So we wanted to print that out for you. So yeah, the big question, how is Bend going to manage growth? So today we're just going to walk through a little bit of a bit of a retrospective on how we're currently managing growth, and then transition into some actions that really provide this and the next council, I think, an opportunity to shape Bend for the next 20 to 50 years. And today we'll be talking primarily at the policy level. So the kinds of projects we're talking about today tend to be more at that policy level, new policies that are directing, managing growth, rather than, so for example, standards and specs, which is an implementing kind of ordinance. So I just wanted to kind of differentiate. Today, we're talking about new initiatives, new projects at the policy level that can affect growth. To my left, we have Brianne Gale, Senior Planner, Damian Cernick to the right. They're each going to cover some subject matter today. And then we'll have some time for questions. So let's jump in. So today's discussion, we're going to talk about a potential strategy for this council to direct staff to start upon. And that would be clearly pointed towards an end target date of about 2045 to 2050, with the potential to go even beyond that. So for a little bit of background, and this is funny because when growth management shows maps of cities and potential UGB expansions, we never use real maps. And the reason is that people get very excited about where potential future urban growth boundaries are going to be. So these are all conceptual and not to scale, but just to show you, so current city limits, let's just say this is your city. The one-time UGB expansion or addition is a brand new legal approach to adding land to the urban growth boundary, specifically for housing and a small amount of supportive commercial. There it is, just this little addition, 100 acres to the city. That is somewhat independent. So this would be more of an independent project, but the city is also required through legal requirements and deadlines to do 20-year land supplies for both housing and employment, shown here in that larger area that would be added. But at the same time, the city looks at changes to the inside of the city. So we would be looking at that classic going up versus going out, or some combination of those strategies to accommodate growth. An urban reserve is land in addition to that urban growth boundary that the city would establish and then essentially urbanize over time. So this is like, you can imagine what we're going to talk about today, kind of relative quick strike for a small amount of land, around 100 acres for residential. A larger project then looks at the next 20 years, and then beyond that, an urban reserve is an additional 10 to 30 years beyond that. So we'll provide some more details and context as we go. This graph shows some historic and anticipated or forecasted population growth for the city of Bend. So the chart starts on the lower left-hand side, back in the early 70s, less than 20,000 people. And of course, we're over 100,000 now. Tremendous growth, I think, that Bend has experienced for those who have lived here for decades. You feel it every day. You see the changes in our landscape, you see new buildings, you see our expansion areas taking hold, and you note changes in the built environment. That growth that is forecasted comes from Portland State University. And this is shown as a 20-year forecast. And it's assuming steady and continued growth. Of course, these estimates can change, but this right now is essentially the amount of growth, the scale and the rate of growth that the state of Oregon is saying, Bend, this is your anticipated population growth. You must accommodate this level of growth. It's not you might want to consider it. These are your population estimates that you must then plan for in terms of managing growth. So that is one piece of managing growth. So the question in our projects, looking ahead 20 years and beyond, would be, how do you accommodate this population? How do you accommodate this through new housing types, more affordable housing types, housing strategies that are providing more affordability? And what's the form of that housing? Up versus out, some combination essentially between infill, redevelopment, and then expansion. And what shapes do those take and where do they happen? The other side of this equation that many people kind of gets less publicity, I think, less press really, is around employment growth. So the city also has an obligation to plan for supporting its economic base and supporting our economy. And so this chart here shows some of the employment growth and employment numbers from about 2002 to 2022. And you'll note that generally speaking, this tracks the same rate as population growth. So our population's growing, and then our employment is growing as well. You see some deviations there around major events and major shocks to the system, the Great Recession, back in 2007, 2008, and then also the pandemic. We don't have forecasts for Bend for its employment, but we can assume that our employment base will also grow in the next 20 years and beyond. What this doesn't show also is something that's really important, is the diversification and change that's occurred since this graph was started back in the 2000s, is that Bend's economy has diversified and changed in that 20-year period of time. So right now, the Economic Development Department, they are focused on doing economic development strategy, a sector targeting analysis. That analysis, it's now starting to take shape. We'll say, what are the sectors that we're expecting to attract? Now that then needs to be transformed essentially into a land use strategy. And that's part of our 20-year planning effort to help manage and grow the local economy. We have, though, an existing framework to manage growth. And so I think for folks on the street and folks that are driving around town, you see a tall building going up, vertical mixed use, for example, and you go, oh my gosh, where did that come from? Oh, right next to the box factory, I think is a great example. Like, where are those buildings coming from? Things are out of control at the city of Bend. Or you're driving out, say out to the airport, you're going out east, northeast, and you drive by Petrosa and you see a new subdivision popping up. Oh, this is uncontrolled growth. This is a bit of a reminder, is that in 2016, the city adopted a new comprehensive plan that looked at our 20-year land need at the time. There were some issues with the timing period, the timing horizon and all that. I don't want to get into the legal case, but essentially said, look, by 2028, this is how we want to grow. We're going to expand in these locations and we're going to do redevelopment, infill, and go up in the core. The graphic on the right shows that. It's an artistic version of our land use plan. You'll see areas on the fringe that have a variety of colors. Those colors represent land uses. That is embodying complete communities. Complete communities are essentially, when we grow out, we tend to grow in ways that mix land uses, mixing housing types, affordability levels, actual housing types, and then mixing employment types and employment lands as well. Maybe a little industrial, a little commercial, maybe some larger format commercial, and then parks and schools. So when we're adding land to the urban growth boundary, it tends to be in these complete communities. That's the current policy of the city of Bend, as represented in our comprehensive plan. And of course, there's the infill and the upzoning and infill that took place in 2016. And that is why folks can drive around town now and see, oh, there are these taller buildings there. Those buildings are intentional. And those are a way to provide needed housing in a different type and location than through expansion. But we also have policies that are guiding infrastructure to then match the land use. And so trying to create a linkage here between these two main topics. It's like you're figuring out your land use, and then you're figuring out the kind of infrastructure to support that land use. You want these things to work together. We did that in 2016 and some other projects beyond. Essentially, our transportation systems plan matches this urban area, and it is focused on all modes, but more of an emphasis on bike and pedestrian systems at transit than previous plans, and in large part to make sure that that land use pattern that was established in 2016 can actually take hold through those investments in bike and ped. And as you know, there are lots of investments that have been made since then. Wastewater systems also based on this land use plan. The dominant theme there is gravity. Use gravity as much as you possibly can, because gravity is cheap, doesn't take energy, and is the most efficient way to move that wastewater to the treatment plant over time. And then also water supply. We've done water master plans. These master plans show that, yes, we do have enough water supply until the end of this planning period and beyond. However, it's very, very obvious that more and more conservation is going to be required in order to keep up with and deal with and accommodate that growth that we're anticipating and that is essentially given to us by the state. And then we have codes that implement these policies. So a whole bunch of work that goes on in terms of managing growth. It is not at the policy level. It could be at the development code level, the standards and specs level. That's equally as important. The idea being you have policies that are heading in a direction. The community knows that direction. We've agreed upon that as a matter of policy. The council has approved that. And then all of these other ordinances should be aligning to that policy. So bit of a retrospective there. And the other thing about Bend is that it's in Oregon. And Oregon is a top-down land use planning system. So there are state laws, there are state rules. These state laws and rules are varied and they are increasingly complex, and they have been getting a lot of attention in the last few years. A couple notable ones, House Bill 2001 from 2023 session, or also called Oregon Housing Needs Assessment, or ONA. A bunch of changes to the state law that are being now codified, or not codified, but there's rulemaking to now implement those laws. The three of us are sitting on rulemaking committees to help shape those rules, but those rules are essentially going to change how the city plans for its housing capacity and its housing need. It's going to change how cities do their urban growth boundary expansion analyses and change how we do urban reserves. So those rules are currently being formulated. They're going to come in and be finalized in the coming years. And then Senate Bill 1537 is a new law that was signed and allows the city of Bend to use this one-time UGB expansion. So this is a brand new way to manage growth that various communities in Oregon are going to be considering, and that we'll give you some more details on coming up. And then climate-friendly and equitable rules. We're calling these the transportation planning rules, essentially. That's what they are now. Those are essentially saying our transportation systems and land use patterns should be pointed towards reducing greenhouse gases and meeting state targets for reducing GHGs. So changing laws at the state level now means we need to change our plans in order to get these in order to match those state laws. There are some deadlines that we can talk about, deadlines and regulatory requirements for us to meet as we're trying to meet those new rules that the state has created. So let's talk about the strategy. This is a graphic. Again, we're going to talk about each one of these in this presentation. They are linked in that they're all addressing some form of managing growth. The one-time UGB addition, Fran's going to cover that, is that one-time small UGB expansion primarily for housing. Then there's another project in the 20-year growth plan and the urban reserve we're imagining bundled as one project. So getting direction from the council eventually on whether or not you want to do an urban reserve will be important for us to know.
When do we make that decision?
I think you'd want to do it before the end of the year, before we do our request for proposals and sign a contract. So the one-time UGB addition is optional. You don't have to use that. It's an option that state law provides the city of Bend. The urban reserve is optional. That's another optional process. We're saying the 20-year growth plan and what we're going to talk about there is mandatory. The reason being is that we have requirements from the state of Oregon that say you need to have these certain things done on this timeline. And if we don't do those things, then I might go to land use jail, or we could end up in the housing acceleration program. There could be consequences to the city by not meeting those deadlines. So we're going to jump into the one-time UGB expansion, then I'll cover the 20-year growth plan, and Damian will hit the urban reserves at the end.
And I just want to know, as Brian pulls up the one-time UGB, the plan is that we are coming to council on June 20th to have a work session to provide some of this information and more detail about the process to see if council wants us to move forward with that opportunity.
Thanks. So I'll jump into kind of the nuts and bolts of Senate Bill 1537. So essentially, this was new legislation that came out of this last legislative session. It allows cities that have a population over 25,000 to do a one-time single site UGB addition of up to 100 net residential acres if they meet some specific requirements. So essentially, there's need requirements. You have to demonstrate that you need the additional land for housing. Those are how much of your existing UGB lands are either developed or have comp plan designations and infrastructure plans. So we believe we meet that threshold. And then there's also the requirement that we have a greater percentage of severely cost burdened households than the state average. So we currently meet that threshold, but those numbers are updated in September. So we may no longer meet that threshold to be eligible come September. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but just know that that's kind of a critical date.
So real quick on that, let's get a council to move forward with this in June, or direct staff to move forward with, but then we fall out of eligibility in the fall.
That's what we'll be talking about at our,
We have
the
a
June
plan around-
20th. Yeah, of how much, how much we're currently working with housing and legal, and we have an internal team of, all right, let's set up the process, and then we'll make some decisions come June of how far along do we want to get before then. So
There's-
we have a plan of how we would kind of address that fork in the road.
Yeah, and we'll present more of that at that work session, but what we want to do is see what the interest might be from the community. So we want to have the work session with council and make sure that council's on board, that we move forward with looking at this opportunity. And then what we're working on now is how do we go out and see, well, how many properties are we talking about? How many interested parties may they be? And then what process do we want to go through? Understanding that September data point is pretty critical on whether we continue forward or we need to go actually back to the state and see if we can adjust that bill to make that process actually work.
And then there's some site and affordability requirements, and I'll get into those here in a minute. Next slide. So who is involved? The city really is the leader in the application process in developing what that application looks like. The bill outlines the requirements, but there is some discretion of how the city wants to run that process. So again, that's something we're starting to develop internally now. And then the city is also the leader in reviewing and approval. The governing body is who makes, the city's governing body is who makes that approval decision. And then the applicant or applicants in this case, their role, they're kind of unique in that they are self-selected, so they can choose if they want to, if they meet the criteria, they can choose if they want to apply or not. They're really the leader in developing and applying for this concept plan and the addition to the UGB. And then the bill has some requirements for public and stakeholder engagement. There's not much public input required for this. There's a minimum of one touch point. One opportunity for public input. And then there's requirements for coordination with the county and the service providers as well. And then DLCD is the final kind of decision-making body of whether or not they would approve the concept plan. And I'll get into that a little bit more of that in a minute here. And then where is this happening? Essentially, this is happening abutting our existing UGB. So it's 100 net residential acres total. So it could be more than that when you account for right of way. There's some requirements for open space. There's also requirements for kind of a minimum amount of mixed use or commercial to basically serve that residential acreage. The land has to be able to be eligible, you need to be contiguous to the UGB. So that puts some parameters on it. And then also this is non-resource land, so it can't be designated farm or forest land. We've taken an initial mapping kind of exercise at what lands might be eligible. Won't go into the map in too much detail, but you can see the darker blue, and then it's kind of hard to tell on this screen, but that kind of more darker turquoise color, those are the larger parcels. And then they're all kind of grouped by parcel size to give you an idea of where some of the larger parcels are that may be eligible. I would note here, again, it has to be contiguous. So some of these showing would have to coordinate with other property owners in order to meet that standard.
And these can happen in multiple locations. It doesn't have to be like one.
It has to be a site.
Multiple properties.
It could be multiple properties, a handful of people could come together, but they have to be contiguous. So next slide. And then just quick, going over some potential opportunities and challenges with this. Essentially, I mean, it's a faster UGB addition process. We anticipate this to be a year, maybe a 2-year process. Again, working through some of those details. It's definitely less cumbersome for the city in that it's kind of applicant led. We would still have an application and review process, but the city isn't the leader in developing the concept plan. And then another opportunity is it's guaranteed land for housing. So there are some affordability requirements for it. So 30% of the units would need to be either available for rent with by households with an income of 80% or less of the area AMI, or for sale. So 30% would need to be either for rent or for sale. And for sale, the requirements are available to buy for households earning 130% or less of AMI.
Can we change that number? I
We
mean, if
don't-
Lynn tells us that we need something different than what is required? Could we have a different threshold?
Potentially, the bill does outline that if you do that, then you have to offset what those costs would be essentially. So it goes into some specificity and we potentially could. We're working through some of those details with legal, but it is specific in that if you change the affordability requirements, there's other things we might be able to change, but specifically if you change the affordability requirements, there are some specific things you'd need to offset those costs through land write-downs or other names, the other mechanisms. And then another opportunity, it's not a land use decision, so it's only appealable by the applicant or the city to DLCD, which does provide a little bit more certainty and a little bit more ease in that regard. And then as far as challenges going, timing, we talked about that challenge with the timing, with those September dates or numbers potentially changing. And it really is dependent on interest from the applicant. So I think that's what Russ was going with is there some process where we might be able to test that a little bit over the summer to see who's even potentially interested in this. And then there's less community input than you would typically have in a larger UGB expansion process. And then also the bill is very specific on the requirements, and it's quite a large burden upfront for an applicant, so that as it's written, an applicant would have to have binding legal agreements with the city and service providers, like at time of application. So we're working through some of those questions and process how that would look too. So
I think it's also important to remember if you do move forward with this, then correct me if I'm wrong, this would be included in our housing needs for the overall UGB. So this would be, it's not just running outside of kind of the overall housing and employment needs. This would be factored into the ultimate kind of math
Right,
on
yeah.
what we would need.
We
so it's
put that-
100 acres that you wouldn't potentially be.
Yeah, it subtracts
Expanding.
from a future UGB expansion.
It's a down payment on future.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not additive. I think some people, oh, it's additive on top. No, not necessarily.
And you've given us rough sort of approximations of what that next expansion could look like, right?
Yep.
So we know.
We know it's more than 100.
We know it's more than
acres.
100 acres, and we know that this would be a faster, less expensive way of doing it than a typical UGB expansion.
True.
And most of this will be the applicant or developer led process. There's a lot of like the master planning and work that they're gonna have to do that is gonna be on their dime to complete that work. There is some work that the city needs to do. That's why we're trying to make sure we truly understand the process, the risk and everything. So when we put it out for working with potential applicants, we want to make sure they understand what's going to be involved as well from their end.
Next slide. And then I won't go into this in too much detail because we will be coming back in June to go through what a process would look like, but just kind of and high level, the bill has some very specific steps as well that you need to take. But like I said, we have an internal team that has started looking into this. We would essentially get council direction. We would establish what our process looked like. The September number would determine eligibility. And then the bill outlines noticing and application review steps, as well as coordination requirements and input. And then I would note here, essentially to go to DLCD for approval. They have 60 days to issue their decision on that. And then the applicant would still have to go through a master plan and annexation application, just our traditional application process.
Okay, we can shift gears now. So that was the one-time UGB addition. Let's look at some of the mechanics and the opportunities and even down into some more details of what's involved in a 20-year growth plan. So you'll see a number of slides here. I think next 4 or 5 slides. Each one of these slides is building on the last. So this is the simplest slide, and there are some commonalities between the slides. On the left-hand side, you'll see a couple different subjects, 5 different groupings. And so what we're trying to do is simplify this, because this can get really complex really quickly. And we could be talking about ORSs and OARs and acronyms, planning acronyms, and we could just keep going like that for hours. So how do you simplify this a little bit so folks understand what is involved in a growth plan? There's going to be a consideration of equity and community engagement. That is a constant throughout doing a 20-year plan. We're engaging the community in this work. Land needs and how to grow. So this is the fundamental kind of component from a land use perspective. Transportation planning is a part of it. Climate is and will be addressed, and then infrastructure is another big rock. So what we tried to do as a group here, and it's pretty, how do we just have one sentence that ties this together? How would you describe the growth plan? Of course, it's a long sentence. So what's involved in the growth plan? Involve our community in guiding our future to support our housing and employment needs, provide high quality transportation facilities and programs in a changing climate and world with high quality water, sewer, stormwater infrastructure, parks and schools. Okay, there you go. So that's it in a nutshell. So what is the approach? The approach in each one of these big rock kind of categories. Let's start off with equity and engagement, is that you're really trying to get out into the public, get out of City Hall, get out of small boardrooms, advisory committees, and that city kind of focus and that more traditional forms of engagement, ones that we use, for example, for the TSP, ones we use for the previous UGB, and try to do more work out in the public and out in the street and out in the community. More of a focus on equitable engagement and really engaging people that have traditionally been underserved in our protected class, that are actually out there that want to participate, but we haven't made that accessible to them as a city. Or folks that are they're just not connected to the city. So let's try to connect them to this work. And just to really keep their input coming through the process to decision makers to influence what happens out of this work to create that growth plan. In terms of land needs and how to grow, it's pretty straightforward. What are our 20-year land needs for housing and employment? There's a lot more to say about that, and particularly around housing, where we're going to have new legal requirements that really are focusing not just on acres. It's not just about the UGB expansion and adding 50, adding 100 or 5,000 acres. That's really done in Oregon now. It's really about how are you going to provide housing and a certain number of units at certain income levels and where you're advancing fair housing. That is where the new rules are pushing cities to go. So it's not as simple, I think, and is more acres focused as it was in the past. And then on the economy, I think we have a really unique opportunity because the city of Bend has not updated its own economic development strategy for decades. So that's an exciting part of this work as well, because the economy has clearly changed and is changing as every day. So transportation plan, this is another big one. As what is the approach is we're going to update those policies, those projects and programs to address growth that we just talked about, provide safe ways to travel around, but also address climate goals that the state has embedded in the CFEC rules. And this is around greenhouse gas reductions. And so the state has set up targets. How are we going to hit those targets as we grow? Climate, our suggestion is to link up the community climate action plan with our land use and transportation strategies to combine these. You still have a community action plan. You still have your climate action plan, but to really have it start recognizing our land use and transportation strategies and pull that climate action plan into our comprehensive plan, so we can see how growth really affects all of these, as well as addressing topics around resiliency, sustainability, adaptation, mitigation, and then infrastructure. We need to have the right infrastructure and really take a really close look at how we're going to be building and funding our infrastructure to support that land use change and to support that growth over time. What are the final products? And this is, you'll notice, oh, go ahead.
You froze.
Next one.
Oh, I froze. Did it freeze? Like refocusing it. No, that's good.
No, you guys,
Okay.
no,
Yeah, we're good. It's a little
looks the
delayed.
same.
Just going too fast.
You go to the matrix, yeah.
What are the final products? So we're talking about updating our comprehensive plan, and many of these are elements of our comprehensive plan. So if you opened up our comprehensive plan today, you would see chapters and policies. And it's essentially kind of the constitution for land use and our infrastructure, and it's guiding that growth. And then you have a bunch of very technical appendices. So we would be updating that, all the chapters and the policies, but then you're getting into very technical appendices of that comprehensive plan. So in terms of equity and community engagement, that's really, those are the events that we hold. So there are a lot of events and there are a lot of activities that take place. Those are the deliverables there. But also we have an equity-focused engagement plan that would support those activities and guide those activities. Land for employment, here come the acronyms. We have an economic opportunities analysis, or EOA. That is what we will be formally adopting as a city. A housing capacity analysis, or HCA. And that's really saying, how much land does the current urban growth boundary, how many housing units can we put here and what type? And if you don't have enough to accommodate your growth, then you talk about more infill and redevelopment strategies, or expansion, or combination. And then a housing production strategy, which I think is going to be really exciting and challenging to figure out more ways and things that we can do to provide specific numbers of units in specific year ranges to hit specific affordability levels. And then a TSP update. This would be a major update to align our TSP with our land use patterns, and then climate, pull that the CCAP into the comprehensive plan. And then there could be changes to our public facility plan. So particularly the collection systems master plan or the water systems master plan. Those are kind of two big ones outside of transportation. So we may or may not be adopting amendments to those. Sometimes the land use goes first, then you amend your PFPs. So these next two, we have the handout for this, and I'm just going to very simply cover this. So there are drivers. There are local drivers and state drivers that influence this work. So you're not just, this plan is not just do the plan, and there are no drivers inside the city's organization or things that are happening here. There are also state deadlines. So we put a graphic together that show a number of these different drivers. The big ones to pay attention to here, 2020, end of 2027, end of 2028, and end of 2029. So we have to have our housing capacity analysis submitted to DLCD, which means it has to be adopted locally and then sent to DLCD for their review by the end of 2027. That is the document that will drive the determination whether or not you need to expand that urban growth boundary. That is a very important document. So that's due in 2027. A housing production strategy due by the end of 2028. In order to at least send that to the state, what we're talking about is tying that housing production strategy with an urban growth boundary expansion, because the UGB expansion area is a part of producing that needed housing at specific income levels. So our project that we're suggesting here, really the bulk of the work is in that 26 to 28 timeframe. And we need to get the UGB done, as well as the housing production strategy and all these products done, really to hit that deadline by the end of 2028. I'm also suggesting do the TSP at the same time. You might as well be doing this. You're going to have to do it the following year. It's due in the end of 2029. So while you're under the hood.
Yeah, it makes, and I'll just jump in, because one of the things that the growth manager team looked at is, in theory, these are all kind of independent tracks. They're either from a House bill or CFEC rules or just standard kind of state land use planning rules. Because Bend is growing so fast and we have so many, we're always answering all these questions, it seems like at the same time or very close to one another. What the team did was look at all the different tracks and what is the best way to line it up to not only answer the housing needs analysis requirements, the CFEC requirements, but also our UGB needs and our land supply needs. So they looked at all the different timelines and played out the dependency map there and came up with this work plan to say, well, let's put this into one big project, because we're answering a bunch of questions, bunch of requirements, and specifically for Bend, we need to do this because we're just growing so fast, and we know that the need is there to not only look at it, but also plan for the future, which is different than a lot of other cities in Oregon.
I think it's also the best way to do the work.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're having one discussion with the public about what Bend is going to look like, how it's going to look and feel and function in one project versus a number of projects. It's also, I think that's the best way to engage people. I honestly think, because it's the most impactful, the most meaningful. And then there's some subtleties too. I personally I don't believe you could meet some of those CFEC requirements and the requirements in the Division 12 planning rule without going into your land use and taking a real close look at your land use patterns in order to hit the various requirements that are in those new transportation planning rules.
And I know that this team won't say, but I'll say it. I think have one of the top teams in the state to figure this stuff out. We have a proven track record of figuring out UGBs, TSBs, one-time UGBs, a lot of acronyms there, but the team is really adept and we want to continue to be leaders on that, not only just because that's just good business, but also, we're growing so fast. We need to be out front, figuring all this stuff out and making sure we understand how this works, because our need's going to be a top priority for the growth of the city.
Russ, you set low expectations, then exceed them.
Yes.
That's what you should do. You set low expectations, exceed the
I have
expectations.
great confidence that you're
You
going to
know.
figure this out.
Come on, man, you're killing me over here.
Too late for low expectations. Brianne, something you mentioned was the high proportion of cost burdened households in Bend. And I think this has implications for both the 20-year plan, but also the one-time expansion. In the big picture, we talk about up versus out a lot, and that has implications in terms of costs, and especially for, I think, cost of infrastructure. And I'm wondering what the particular implications are for cost, having a high proportion of cost burdened households are in terms of some of these trade-offs that we think about in terms of housing costs, diversity of housing options, but especially for cost of infrastructure when we're considering something like an expansion versus infill. What are the implications for, because it sounded like you were saying, we make these trade-offs a lot. That's part of the normal track process. But considering that Bend has a high proportion of cost burdened households, what are the implications of the kind of trade-offs that we make in this process? Does that make sense?
Are you referring to the one-time UGB
Well, I
expansion?
think it implicates
Any of
both,
them.
because, for
Right.
example, I've heard, and maybe it's too site specific to generalize, but the cost of providing something like infrastructure for expanding out might be generally more expensive than
Than-
providing infill
Yeah.
infrastructure, but that depends on what the existing infrastructure looks like.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, when you say this process is a little bit different because we have a high proportion of cost burdened households, why is it different?
Well,
Your phone a friend just arrived.
yeah, well, I mean, no, I mean, I think. Well, we don't necessarily have a high proportion, and that's kind of the issue.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
okay.
so, and that's, I assume that's where you're gonna
Yeah,
go with
yeah.
it, but, yeah, we may actually no longer have a high enough
Because they're-
proportion to meet, to
priced
actually
out.
qualify. Because they're being priced out essentially, but Lynn could
What we're
expand on that
seeing
better.
come from
than I could.
Mendez is displacement, which is actually lowering our cost burden amount, because the folks who are arriving here have the means to be here. Whereas folks who don't have the means to be here are getting pushed to farther communities and therefore have a longer commute. I think that's a piece of the cost burden and what we're fearful with the one-time UGB expansion is that we may fall under the state average because of this displacement. The second thing I wanted to talk about, if it's okay, is a little more theoretical, so I'll just try to keep it really brief, but it's the cost of going up versus going out. And it's not just what's under the ground that has that cost. It's also the cost to support buildings that are taller and the financing that comes with that. And what we're seeing in the market right now in a big picture sense is that that cost is really hard to finance going up, and that density, what we're not seeing a lot without it, a lot of incentives in our core area. It's important, and that's part of our job, is to figure out how to get that done. But what we are seeing is in our annexation areas, because those are smaller loans to build smaller product, those are continuing on. And so that's a really interesting dynamic that I think is a real world consideration for you all, could change tomorrow. We hope it changes tomorrow, to be honest. But right now, we're seeing, even despite incredible efforts by this team and others to densify internally, that's not where a lot of production is coming because of the lending conditions and market conditions. So that's just something that I think these guys will continue to track. And we collectively will make strategies and bring things to you to approve that will hopefully work. That's the goal. But that is a factor to keep in mind. It's not just the infrastructure, it's also the cost of going up.
And any comments on general infrastructure costs?
It's always, I mean,
Infill versus expansion. I mean,
Yeah.
essentially, are you asking, is it cheaper to infill than expand?
in some, we have been as a unique infrastructure, we have our unique infrastructure challenges, but yeah, I mean, typically you want to maximize the infrastructure investment that you already have. However, when we densify, we also need to make some significant improvements because we don't have capacity in certain areas. So it's kind of a hard, depends where you are in town.
That makes sense.
I think you're, to maybe also help answer, on the one-time UGB expansion, for example, you're not doing this compare and contrast. You're comparing and contrasting a couple different applications or sites that come in, right? You're presuming that because they're applying, they can meet the requirements, which means you're hitting these affordability requirements. In the larger work in the 20-year, you can do that. You are looking at infrastructure costs. We are comparing the cost, for example, cost per acre of infrastructure over here versus over here. And you can compare that with the cost to serve inside as well, because there are costs to serve infill and redevelopment as well. So you can get at that. You don't really get at it with the one-time UGB expansion. You do get at it a little bit more and more with the 20-year look. So.
And I'm gonna just from a time check, Brian, probably like another 5-10, and then we need to move on to the next.
Yep.
item, so.
Perfect. Go ahead.
All right, thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everybody. The final part of our presentation is on the urban reserves. As Brian mentioned, this is an optional project, one that we're recommending that council consider as part of our overall strategy for managing Bend's growth. What this area refers to is inherent in its name. These are areas that we'd be reserving for future expansion of the urban growth boundary when needed. This would provide an additional 10 to 30 years of supply for housing and jobs. Next, please. Everybody who would be involved in the development of our growth plan, including in some kind of expansion of the urban growth boundary, would also be engaged in helping us with the urban reserve. This is a decision that would have to be adopted by both the city and the county. We'd be asking the county to adopt the same reserve and amend their comprehensive plan, their maps accordingly. We'd also be coordinating with the county to adopt a management agreement for these areas in the reserves, because they would still have zoning authority. And we would want to have them retain that authority for issuing land use decisions and building permits, but also ensuring they have codes in place that would allow development to continue under current zoning, current county zoning, without interfering with urbanization in the future. We'd also be entering into management agreements with the special districts that would serve these new areas that would be eventually included in the boundary, such as the Park District and the Fire District. The area that we'd be looking at would be immediately outside of the urban growth boundary. And as I mentioned, it's under the county's jurisdiction. These are areas that are currently designated on the county's comp plan. These are either rural residential areas or in some kind of a resource designation like exclusive farm use or forest use. And the reason that's part of our discussion today is that when looking at an urban reserve, there is state law that directs decision-making in urban reserves that mirrors what's already in state law and urban growth boundaries. And what the law directs us to do is look first as a city to those areas that are rural residential, including those that are urban reserve for future urbanization, for looking at exclusive farm use zones or forest zones. So there's a number of opportunities for looking at doing an urban reserve to provide benefits to the city. Probably first and foremost is that we'd be setting some expectations with the public as to where the city will grow in the future. We've been doing that in part with our 20-year growth plan and saying, here's where our future boundary is. But with the urban reserve, we tell people know where additional growth will be taking place when that land's needed for housing and or for jobs. This is the potential of also reducing our costs and legal risks down the road, because one of the benefits of doing an urban reserve is that once it's done, that's the area you would look to first for any expansion of the urban growth boundary. With that work on urban reserve planning, we'd also be doing some higher level infrastructure planning. So we'd be looking to see if we would need any new sewer interceptor lines, how we'd extend the county road network to make it a more urban grid, but also looking at our water storage and then distribution system. Now, there are some challenges with that as well. As we move further out, we will encounter property owners that don't see the urban reserve as a good decision for them. They want to be in the boundary now so they can develop more quickly. But we're also going to see more property owners that tell us, hey, I don't want to be in either the UGB or the urban reserve. So I think we have to reconcile and resolve as we move forward. And then going back to what I mentioned a moment ago about different plan designations, with the areas outside of Bend that are rural residential, some are in large blocks that might be better to urbanize over time. Some are existing rural subdivisions. So after we've kind of exhausted those areas that are more suitable for urban development, we're gonna be looking at the areas that are currently zoned exclusive farm use under the county's comprehensive plan. And that's where the legal standard becomes a little bit tougher to meet to show that we need this area for future urbanization more than we might need it for producing marketable farm crops or livestock. So with respect to how this gets done, some of this work for developing an urban reserve, we can do during the development of our growth plan. When it comes to estimating land supply for this reserve, this is something where we can extend our population, housing, and employment forecast out an additional 10 to 30 years, depending on direction from council, to see what that supply would be. As we're evaluating areas for expansion, we can also identify those areas that might not be ready now, but might be good to include in a reserve as the city grows out. And it's also that opportunity to complete that higher level infrastructure planning, because that's something we're going to be doing anyway as we update our growth plan for water, sewer, and transportation infrastructure. In addition to that, with our work with the county, we'd again be asking them to adopt the same reserve and amend their comprehensive plan and their maps accordingly. We'd also be asking the county to enter into a management agreement with us so that they could continue to manage these lands in the reserve, but subject to new codes that we would develop with them to ensure that development could take place under their current zones, but that wouldn't necessarily interfere with, say, the future development of an interceptor line or requiring larger setbacks from future road rights of way that might require a larger setback. And then again, ensuring either before or at the time we adopt a reserve, adopting management agreements with the special districts that be affected so that they knew upfront we're going to be adopting these areas as urban reserves, and at some point bringing them into the urban growth boundary, and we'll need to use the district to serve them as they would.
So let's wrap this up by just taking a look at some of the timelines and products that are involved in this. So if you think of these three subjects as kind of a multi-phase approach to managing growth, you can consider the one-time UGB edition as kind of phase one. You could start that as soon as we have the next touch point with the council. I believe it's next month. Yeah, so on the 20th. So we'll get some direction there. And that can lead to a go, no go. That is going to likely run into 2025 to 2026. We've already been working on the request for proposals or RFP for the 20-year growth plan. Have some discussions with council on governance and the kind of structures that you as a council want to use to help create that bridge between the full council and the community and community engagement. And then you can look at some of the adoption. We're assuming we're going to be adopting some of these products in the second phase of the work before 2027. And that's around our need, our need estimates. How much housing land do we need? How much employment land do we need? And then phase three, wrapping it up with that, the rest of the adoptions of our transportation systems plan, housing production strategy, climate friendly areas, and any expansion. And then partway through that, kind of the last year of that 20-year growth plan, really taking a look at, okay, what about the urban reserve? So you want to tie those together as well. You don't want those to be completely independent. And so, yes, we're happy to answer more questions that you have.
So just to frame this correctly, because we have a couple minutes for questions, we'll come back on the June 19th work session with council to get direction on the one-time UGB. And then really we'll come back and present all things around the growth plan, both for the climate friendly rules and UGB, as well as the area reserves, similar to what you saw here at the quarterly meeting on July 20th. I think the big thing that they'll be asking for at that time is, should we be looking at that urban area reserve work as part of this? Does this make sense? Because as you can tell, there's a lot of integration with all the moving parts and pieces, and they want to make sure that they're approaching this project correctly and getting the right group of consultants on board as well to do all this work. Is that right, Brian?
Yes, yeah, sounds good.
Russ, June 20.
June 20th, 19th.
20? Oh, because we moved it, right? Sorry, June 20.
Amy, again, Brian, about the need for the additional acres and how I know that Councilor Broadman touched on that a little bit, but I think it'd be helpful because how much more in addition do we need and where we're at? How does that connect with, some of the infill target numbers that we can hit?
Sure. And Brianne led this project. It was the housing capacity analysis, kind of a draft, kind of an update. And it was using older numbers. So I want to be clear, at that time, when we did the work, the estimate was between 200 plus or minus and 700 plus or minus acres of UGB expansion, primarily for single unit detached type of housing. Reason being that the changes that the city had made at the time, in 2016 for infill and redevelopment and some of the other projects that are happening in those UGB expansion areas are coming in more dense, and we're getting more housing units out of the urban area that we have than we predicted, in 2016. So, essentially, yeah, it would be a fairly reasonable, small to reasonable size UGB expansion. The numbers that we're gonna get, though, in January from the state we'll be able to look at those numbers on the housing need numbers that we have and go, well, how close were we? We're gonna have to try to interpolate between those numbers we get and the work that we had done previously.
And that didn't account for underproduction either.
Right.
Those need numbers. And it doesn't account for employment or plans either.
Right.
And you wouldn't use that you wouldn't recommend that council use that information in determining whether or not an urban reserve is prudent or not. I mean, that's a longer term analysis, right?
Correct.
So don't wait until January to make these early determinations regarding either 1537 or the conversation on urban reserves.
I think I wouldn't use the HCA, the draft HCA as, boy, we really should use this as a major, the major consideration for determining whether we should do an urban reserve or not. And I do think ideally we would need to know by the end of the year so we can scope this, but we can also construct a request for proposals or contract that says, look, we might have an add-on that we'll figure out, later on in the contract period, say by 2027, 2026, that we might do, council might be interested in doing an urban reserve as well. So ideally we get that direction early so we can have the best team brought in. I don't think it's a make or break though in the actual contracting, so it doesn't hold up the 20-year growth plan work.
We also, I mean, if you read the tea leaves of what, discussions that are happening at the state and possible UGB changes to kind of how the land process works, I think urban area reserves might be one of the key factors going into that, along with kind of what were the one-time expansion. So some type of hybrid of those two. And that's why just from an organization, we will be pretty close to those because we've had success with House Bill 4079, the Stevens Road track that we did. This is potential the third option on that. And you can see how those could blend with, well, if you have an urban area reserve, is there another set of rules to do kind of quicker UGBs under the right guidelines and processes? So.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of concern that I have about whether designating an area as urban reserve. I mean, I think it depends on how extensive it is. Does that make it inevitable or more likely to see that expansion in the future? Because that, depending on the timing, I would worry that would undermine some of the other climate and other goals associated with infill. But I think because just for time, we can probably come back at that in the July meeting, give you a little bit more information about how that tool is used in the current context. That might be a good idea because it's also, you still have to go through additional steps before you can actually bring something in, but it also protects certain land development patterns out in the county to make sure the city could grow in a direction if it wanted to.
I mean, I think one benefit of it is possibly preventing the county from rezoning county land into rural sprawl, which is, I think that's a distinct possibility that exists in the world under the system right now.
Good point.
There's a balance in there, but I think we can bring back some more information around that when we come back.
Thank you.
So we got a couple other good topics. So if council's good, we'll continue to move on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Many more, as you can tell, many more conversations. We're just kind of setting the ground, the foundation and framework for this. So we're going to transition into one of the Midtown crossings for a couple of reasons. Ryan and his team are going to come up and talk about the Greenwood pilot project that we're doing and the status of that. I'm sure council has started to hear some public input around that. The designs are getting finalized. I wanted our engineering group to come in front of this group just to get an update of what's going on, where that project's at, what they're hearing. It's also just an example as we go into the next part of the conversation around our standards and speeds. This is a great example of kind of how all these things come together when you actually have a project in an existing corridor. So we'll kind of build off of this in the next segment. So,
Perfect. Thanks, Russ. So real quick, as a reminder, May is National Bike Safety Month. So wanted to keep that on everybody's awareness. And tomorrow, the City Young Professionals Group, along with Commute Options, is holding an event called Walk and Roll to Work. It's kind of a lunchtime brown bag event that we're helping host as well. So with that said, Greenwood Avenue is one of the council objectives, and it is identified in our general obligation bond to do some improvements there along Greenwood. So Todd and Garrett as well have been working quite a bit to try to figure out how to put something in place here that balances all the needs we have in this area. So we'll get into some of those details as we go along here. But I will mention we've got Deputy Fire Chief Mike Hand in the back there. If you could wave, Mike, that'd be great. If we need any clarification, anything from a Bend Fire and Rescue standpoint in terms of what they need to maintain response times, I'm sure Mike would be happy to step up as well. Okay, so to frame it up a little bit, just so you can tell, we're talking about the Greenwood Underpass here. There's multiple other moving projects that are happening at the same time. So we've got the Bend Bikeways project, which is part of the Franklin comments you heard from some members of the public early on. The Franklin Undercrossing project, which is another portion of the work that Todd's working on here. The Hawthorne Bridge, of course, is probably high on everybody's radar. The Second Street, which really connects Franklin to Greenwood, as well as provides the ramp up to get on the Hawthorne. And then the only key route work as well. So basically everything you see in green there is all being designed and attempted to be coordinated here simultaneously. So it is a lot of work and a lot to balance here. So we do want to recognize the importance of Greenwood, though. It is a key east-west route, especially in light of, we know the Hawthorne Bridge is still a few more years out. Oh, you're jumping on us.
No, we had an internet question came up. I think you're good.
Yeah, and then we do have some improvements coming on Franklin here soon as well. So at some point in the future, we're going to be having to use Greenwood as basically the key movement and detour for bikes, peds, and for a portion of time, probably vehicles as well. So background. So again, Midtown, which is Franklin, Greenwood, Second, and Hawthorne. In the effort of trying to save some time, I won't get into every one of these, but want to highlight that Greenwood is not identified as one of our low stress bicycle networks. We have a low stress network map that was adopted in the last TSP that Brian was just referring to as well. Greenwood is not on that map, and some other routes are, only is. But it is a key connection that we all can understand is one of the few ways to get safely into downtown from the east side of town. So the intent of this project, what we're trying to do is provide a safe bike travel route, make it compatible with the existing conditions out there, make it safe for pedestrians as well, and integrate it into the larger concept of Franklin and Hawthorne that's eventually coming. All that being said, we are aware that Greenwood has been identified by Bend Fire and Rescue as one of the key routes that they utilize in terms of responding, as well as transporting back from the call to the hospital. Greenwood's obviously key to being able to do that as it connects to Highway 20 as you work your way east.
Yeah, so looking at we did go out to the public on April 9th with an open house, identifying some of the sort of low cost, low risk implementation treatments that would meet safety goals, that would kind of be a way to test out kind of what this road diet is, going to one lane that could potentially, be evaluated during that period and allow us to examine whether this is a successful project meeting goals of congestion, safety, etc. So these are sort of the treatments that we're looking at. They're not permanent in so much. We are still looking at a concrete median for the low stress network crossing at Harriman, but generally the other things are bollards and paint that would be the treatment on this project. Key information on Greenwood, what we're looking at, we do have a insufficient sidewalk width existing. We have documented history of rear end turning pedestrian bicycle crashes. very, very narrow parking. You talk to the businesses there. They have a bin full of people's rear view mirrors. There are currently 66 parking spaces. Very high speeds were signed for 20 miles an hour, and we're seeing, 30-mile-an-hour speed going through there. And congested conditions right now. We're looking at like 5 minutes of travel from Third over to Wall, westbound, and eastbound. It's, even longer than that. So proposed conditions, and we will open up kind of what the treatment is after this, but looking at 11 use shared use path, road diet, that's just sort of the statistics in terms of what happens with safety. We see marked improvements with crash outcomes, reducing crashes. We're proposing widening parking, but sort of at the expense of maintaining parking, maintaining travel lanes, maintaining turn lanes. We are looking at a reduction of parking spaces, and we've certainly heard from the businesses, especially on the north side of the street, that parking is a priority. And I don't know, perhaps you've heard from some of them. I certainly have. Yeah, we're looking at narrower lanes and just channelization that would reduce speeds potentially on the roadway. And we are talking another minute of travel time for these changes when we go from 4 lanes down to 3 lanes, 2 travel lanes and a turn lane. Yeah, again, I mentioned the open house, kind of the feedback we got. We went to the public with looking at a curbside parking protected options. There was a preference for parking protected, but a lot of this coordination, specifically speaking with fire and emergency response, the curbside parking gives us a wider roadway, and just meeting kind of fire code and meeting the needs of all stakeholders. And then maintenance as well, just being able to clear snow and gravel will be simpler with option 1. And we certainly heard that from the feedback from the public too, that some people did have concerns about that and the conditions on the parking protected ones. So yeah, it was generally this project. We've been weighing a lot of options, hearing a lot of feedback from as many folks as we can to just make a recommendation of proceeding with the curbside parking, buffered bike lane, monitoring that for a year, specifically looking at travel time, vehicle counts, bicycle usage. Knowing that this block that I'm showing here between Harriman and Hill, these property owners on the north side, the businesses there, they are not happy with that parking removal. And we're very well aware of that. However, the trade-offs, like with everything, the benefits to safety, the benefits to operation, we do recommend that potentially outweighs their parking, and we're looking at ways to appease their needs with getting additional ADA spaces around the block on Harriman or Hill. And then
we can always flip back to a slide if we want to dig into some weeds.
I was gonna open up the
Yeah.
So I was gonna open up sort of what we're showing right now.
So I think as they bring this up, and Ryan can talk about this more, the team looked at several different designs and trying to figure out, especially working with EMS, because it's such a critical corridor, where will people pull off if a fire truck's going through there, or police? Where can we get vehicles out of the way so we can get fire trucks through that corridor? And as you start to float the parking and or start putting in additional protections in the bike lanes, you start to have those conflicts. And so one of the things that we're proposing with this project is it is a pilot project. And the idea is that we want to go out there, restripe the road, put in a certain level of improvements out there, see how it reacts. And then I'll use it as a pilot saying, what are we hearing from bike users? What are we hearing from people trying to park? What are we hearing from EMS? And then add in potential additional layers of protection or things like that as we go through this project. There's just so many changes going on in this corridor. From a staff perspective, we are recommending, let's get it painted. Let's get the buffered bike lanes in there. Let's put some delineators in there at a certain cadence, but still allow vehicles to move out of the way and see how everybody reacts to it. And then if it's working right and we can add more things in, we will do that and use this as a little test project in terms of trying different things on a corridor.
Yeah, so I was just hoping to walk east to west too, just pointing out at a high level kind of what the treatments are. We are full aware that ODOT has improvements planned from second to sixth-ish. It's been a very long, long process in terms of like, but right now we are stopping our improvements at second, and we'll have kind of wayfinding for bicycle users to then navigate to Hawthorne, with the ultimate vision of connecting onto the existing bike lanes on Third. But yeah, generally the treatments, what we're showing is protection with bollards and Duracurb, which is kind of what was used on Wilson at intersections. And that would allow, when EMS does come through with sirens, it would allow vehicles to pull into those kind of unoccupied spaces and allowing EMS to pass. Those turn lanes should also help with that too, but we are showing, yeah, generally a two-way turn lane and new turn lanes, First Hill and other locations. Moving into, and then we are showing bulb outs at the intersections, so just improving pedestrian visibility. That'll, and especially going down to 3 lanes will really shorten that crossing time. And then moving into the undercrossing, there are kind of the closely spaced bollards right at the intersection. And then we do move to spacing them out further as we go down into the undercrossing. And again, this is to allow vehicles to pull over and EMS to get through this very constrained space. And generally, when we look at the crash patterns, they're centered around intersections. Like, we don't see crashes in these kind of straightaway places. Feeling that the closely bunched stuff up towards the entrance of these bicycle lanes should set the precedence for vehicles moving through there to kind of certainly stay in that one lane.
What are the red circles?
So the red circles, that's just paint and bollards, and that's where we were talking about the painted bulb out treatments for pedestrians.
There's stop signs on there too.
Got it.
Is what-
That's what it is.
I know it's kind of hard to read the word stop up
Okay,
there, but yeah,
okay.
those are stop
Okay.
controlled.
And then we are, since Harriman is a low stress network, we are showing a concrete medium, which is a lot of speaking and weighing trade-offs with EMS and fire. But we are showing a concrete median there, certainly shortening the distances of that, just in case it needed to be mountable by the vehicle, by the fire apparatus. Making provisions for Cascades East Transit as well. Right now, they're sharing space with the bikes. I think potentially in the ultimate build out, it is a floating bus island or something else that, but right now we're paint and sharing the space for the limited headway that's on buses right now. And then carrying this treatment all the way to Wall, connecting the existing bike lane that's there, east and westbound.
If you go back to Hill and Harriman real quick, just to highlight what Todd was pointing out before, is you can see on the north end there in front of those businesses where there is on-street parking today, we're proposing that goes away. So you've got a protected, as in buffered with paint and some bollards, bike lane, then a 11-foot travel lane, and then some room in that turn lane for vehicles to pull out if need be. That's the biggest change that we're hearing from the public in terms of how it operates today. Obviously, a lot of vehicles can use this today because there's 2 lanes in each direction all the way through. The turn lane can actually help alleviate some of the congestion you get. When you have 2 lanes in each direction, but no dedicated turn lane, somebody's stopping in a through lane to turn across 2 lanes of traffic, which increases delay time. But there is parking still on the south side of the Greenwood here. You can see those hash marks down below with the bulb outs are representing some on-street parking that anybody can use. And then we do have some access points there's a parking lot kind of mid-block, a driveway that we need to keep open in there as well for access to some of those businesses that have a single direction of movement past their businesses. So yeah, this is a balance. This is not an easy one to navigate without kind of having to make some compromise for all of the users in the system. So yeah, the biggest thing, as Todd noted, is we want to proceed We hope to come back in front of council in, for what we call it, our guaranteed maximum price one or GMP one for Greenwood, second and Franklin, but that GMP one is a focus on Greenwood and it would enable us to go out and construct this so that we can start monitoring and collecting data. And then we would track that and eventually come back to council for further guidance of changes or full implementation, or how does that interact with the Hawthorne Bridge, which is just 2 blocks south of here, and what's the timing of that? When that's going to be fully built out and constructed. But this is the staff recommendation here in terms of what we do on Greenwood for now.
And timing in terms of that contract and construction.
Late July.
Yeah, we want to get it done before, so we can start monitoring some data this summer and fall.
So it's gonna be this summer, so they're also looking at the possibility of night work in the corridor to do this, because of it's gonna be impactful, no matter how.
And then monitor it through the winter seasons and
Yeah.
all, into next year at this time and then through next summer, so we get a full cycle.
So one, we wanted to bring awareness to council of kind of where this project's at and also as it'll lead into the next conversation, we'll make sure if we address any questions here and then we'll move on to the next one, but just how we balance all these different competing needs and requests on a corridor. Because we have a lot of people that want more, a lot of people that want less, a lot of people don't even know why we're doing this in the first place. But also just as a reminder for everybody, this facility now has no bike lanes on it, right? And we're gonna be moving traffic back and forth. And we also want to be transparent of, it will probably cause more delay at certain intersections. That is true. What that really is gonna look like is we run the models, but we'll keep analyzing that over the life cycle of this project. But there are definitely trade-offs in trying to accommodate all these different things into a design.
And that's part of the monitoring process is we'll be making, if we need to, some signal timing modifications at Third and over at Bond to alleviate some of that east-west. It might increase the north-south as a result, but kind of reduce some of that east-west travel time that we anticipate. As Todd noted, at least a 1-minute addition to travel time for vehicles through here.
When is the only work gonna be done?
You have a good date on that now, Garrett or Carrie, either one of you?
Go, Mike.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Garrett Saber, EIP. Our current schedule right now is we're trying to start only beginning of next year. There's concerns of when we start Franklin, so we're coordinating with BNSF, ODOT, other agencies on that. So if that gets delayed at all, with Franklin being a higher priority, we'd likely push only back another year to not be starting until 2026. Because Franklin is scheduled right now to be probably the middle of 2025. We just don't want to see a delay or both of these east-west corridors under construction at the same time.
So this would be started before Olney and Franklin?
Yes, this we want to get built in the next month or two.
Yeah.
This one's only 2 or 3 weeks of work.
Right.
We're working within the curb to curb width, all night work. So getting it done definitely before Franklin, because part of what we talked about 2 years ago was having this as a detour for bikes and peds when we have to close the undercrossing.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, we've had I feel like there's been a lot of council momentum on the bikeways.
Mhm.
And a lot of it is, well, we need more resources to do it at the level we want. But then we're not even starting with a low stress network, right? The first thing we're doing is a non-low stress network project on Greenwood. So I struggle a little bit with like the prioritization of what we're working on. I mean, I know bikeways in Franklin and Penn, Olney, Portland are bigger projects. But, and I'm not trying to reorder things because you've got direction from the whole council.
That's a valid point, though. Councilor Broadman is in a perfect world, we'd be building the Hawthorne overcrossing bridge.
Sure.
Which would significantly impact what we'd be doing on these. Yeah, but
and set that aside.
it is what it is for now.
I think the right order to do things, and this isn't like a criticism of staff or council at all, it's mainly just the environment we're working in. I would love to have us starting on the low stress network and on the bikeways that we prioritized in the goals first, rather than like, this is not going to be a route. One, it's not a low stress network. It's not even designed to be or suggested to be under the TSP. It's not really going to be a route that a child or an elder or a choice user is ever going to use. I don't think. I mean, I hope it is safe enough, but I don't think it is. So we're just, I struggle with the prioritization here of what we're working on.
Yeah, and we're also trying to make sure that we can move people as effectively as we can during construction.
Yeah.
Right, so
we're
that's,
increasing traffic times by 20%.
yeah, well, also with bikes, so if we completely close down Franklin, they've got no place to go.
Yeah.
Right.
They
so
have, I mean,
That's
at some point, New Portland is supposed to be a low stress network.
right,
Mhm.
but in terms of around downtown, if we're trying to provide as many different options as we can, they're not, again, these are the trade-offs that we deal with in terms of
Yeah.
trying to balance all these, how do we get it to, what effective level can we get it to with kind of existing corridors, budgets and things like that, and then also.
Basically, Greenwood is gonna be like the safety valve for everything else closing east-west through downtown.
Yes, over
Yes.
the next few
Not a low
years.
stress network.
Yeah.
Correct.
That's tough. That's a tough spot.
It is.
And we're increasing driving time 20% east to west, right?
Yep, it's gonna be a busy corridor over the next couple of years. Yeah.
I'll remind you, like, to your note of wanting to prioritize, we did land on Greenwood as this quick build option. So that we could get it done sooner,
Yeah.
that we would
Yeah.
have that in place prior to starting Franklin. And so Franklin, the bikeway is gonna be our first priority. That's why we would be delaying only if by chance only slips it all due to that other coordination too. So this all falls within T-Box initiatives of doing all of our key route projects prior to any of the others in the bond funded program as well.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with the point about prioritization. I would say, of all the lower priority project, this is a pretty good one, especially considering it's not a real heavy lift in terms of construction time.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, I don't mean to
No, that's a
minimize
valid statement. Yeah,
staff
it's
time
not a
spent
6
on
month,
it.
yeah.
I think this will be a big improvement, especially for people who are crossing. A lot of times it's really hard to cross multiple lanes of traffic, even though you may have the legal right of way. There's just a challenge for drivers to have that visibility. So this seems like a really big improvement in that regard. And this is an identified corridor in the safety action plan that the city of Bend had adopted 3 or 4 years ago in a way. I think my question is about what it connects to. If somebody is going eastbound on a bicycle and they want to get to downtown, what is the preferred route that they take?
Well,
Eastbound.
Sorry, westbound. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Turning on wall if it's.
Yeah,
eastbound.
thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, so westbound, where do they come from here?
So if they're, start at Second Street with the end of the edge of the project,
Mhm.
and they're going westbound and they want to visit, Ben Brewing Company or,
Mhm.
Something like that.
Yeah, well, this would get you, if you span all the way to the west, this will get you safely over to the Bond Wall area. And then you'd have to just kind of navigate through the existing system there.
Use the sidewalk
And
system.
sidewalks, and there is a crossing
Mhm.
just past the last light before you get to the Newport Bridge. There's a pedestrian safety island there that we got installed a few years back. You could get down to that point and cross there, but
Right, okay, so because there's still a section along there that also doesn't have a bike lane, and you probably just use the sidewalk on.
This is building bike lane, all the missing bike lanes between Second and basically the Newport Bridge, I would think. I think we'd have a complete
pretty
system
close, yeah.
of bike lanes and facilities. You'd be using the signals and the crosswalk systems, either the stripe systems that are being created, the non-signalized intersections, or the push buttons at the intersections to cross, unless you were a rider that wanted to use lanes.
Not including between Bond and Wall Street, is that correct?
Between Bond and Wall, go between Bond, it does correct the
Yeah,
situation
we-
between Bond and Wall.
Yeah, we did have some proposed striping changes there.
Yeah, so there are bike
So
lanes.
you
that
would get
carry
a bike
through.
lane protected,
Yep.
or at least buffered, I should say, up to that wall intersection.
And again, also remember, we're also trying to do, most of the state law says too, we're supposed to have bike lanes and arterials and collectors, so we're trying to manage that as well, as we go through here. So this is, and we can transition, if you have any more, we can transition into the third part of this. It's a great example of what the engineering team is trying to achieve and the struggles that they have and all these competing interests and comments and looking at our standards. That was kind of the third part of the conversation we want to bring forward. Is there a different way that we could look at doing these things? just some of the public feedback that you hear, again, trying to balance all these. So I don't want to prematurely stop this conversation, but if everyone's good, we can, unless you have any other questions specifically on that corridor, we just want to make sure you're aware of that as that contract comes through. If you've had some chance to see it. If you have any specific questions, please feel free to reach out to Ryan, Todd, or Garrett, and they'd be more than happy to sit down with you and show you more information about that.
And the next time, as I noted, council would see Greenwood would be at the contract for guaranteed maximum price one, with our or with our alternative delivery team.
All right, so going into the third part of this conversation, which is all around our standards, both for the physical built environment and how we look at speeds and how we set speed limits. So Ryan, go and flip it. I'm going to open this up. So what we want to do is go through kind of what our policies are, again, at a very high level, what our engineering team is kind of working through, what their public involvement process is and how they're gathering feedback. And we have a couple questions from council around. We also want to make sure as we go through this, what is council hearing as we go through these designs and these projects? I mean, I think we heard some of the comments just even earlier at this meeting. And we're trying to figure out, is there clarity that we need to do? Is there another conversation we need to have with the community around our standards? And should we be looking at our project involvement a little, when we actually get down to a specific project, should we look at how we interact with the public differently to try to have better communication back and forth? And then the second part of that is we'll look at how speeds are set on our existing roads and what options we may or may not have around speeds.
Okay, so a little bit of a background here on a lot of what we've been doing and learning over the last couple years since the bond was adopted and the prioritization for multimodal was put highest on the list. So exciting news, Wilson is wrapping up. We're going to have a quick little ribbon cutting tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. and we'll open that back up to traffic. As a side note, there will be some additional work still ongoing under traffic, landscaping, some installation of some items. But that's important to note that Wilson is going to be opened, and that is the first truly fully funded project by the general obligation bond. And similar to what we were just talking about on Greenwood and how that's going to be the kind of the focal point as we're doing other work, Wilson will be the focal point in the future as we build the Reed Market Bridge over the rail crossing there. So again, we wanted to attack this one first. So it's looking like a good product overall. We have the protected intersection, protected roundabout at 9th and Wilson, which is one of the first in the country to ever do so. Of course, we're continuing to evolve and learn along the way. Our public outreach process, though, significantly changed what the cross-section and footprint of Wilson look like compared to what we were told in our transportation system plan to do. So we're getting now protected bike lanes on both sides with DuraCurb, and we're getting safe intersections at 9th, at 3rd, and at 2nd. But doing something different than what was identified in our TSP with the identified funding from our TSP and GeoBond resulted in some pretty significant cost overruns on the Wilson project, which, as you know, Council, is we kind of had to borrow from our transportation CIP to help offset this, and we're continuing to propose to do that in some instances. Other stuff, we just talked on Greenwood example here. That's a good example of trade-offs. We didn't have to do too many trade-offs on Wilson other than cost. But Greenwood's a great example of what has a higher priority: parking for the businesses, safe bike lanes, fire EMS, travel time reliance. All those have to be weighed. And so during our outreach efforts and while talking to internal and external stakeholders, we just kind of have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of all that. So we're continuing to do that now as we work through a litany of both existing and future projects that we have coming up. So we've already hit on Midtown, which is Franklin, Greenwood, Hawthorne, and 2nd. Bend Bikeways is on that as well. We're kicking off design and open house efforts for Bear Creek and 27th. Those are key routes. The only bike ped project we mentioned. Butler Market project is continuing to move forward in the design process. But that's another example of something that is well beyond of what was initially thought of to be done. But Butler is one of the north-south key routes that council identified as being a part of the Bend Bikeways. So we're enhancing the safety and connectivity on that. Portland Avenue was mentioned earlier. and then continued efforts on the other key routes and greenways. So all of those on the left are in current some level of design that we're working through now. And every one of those is unique. Every one of them has a different right of way, different existing conditions, and different needs. So we're trying to balance all these desires to create a system that'll function best for all users. As a side note, I'm not going to go through the bullets there, but you can see there's a lot of other transportation related projects, mainly coming out of the GEO bond that we are going to get started here in the next couple of years. So the main premise behind talking about what are our current standards today will frame up in some formal questions, but we're right here in the middle of, we can't stop what we're doing now because that would be a complete waste of effort and money. But before we initiate some of these other things, do we need to take a different approach compared to what we're doing today? And is there a more comprehensive way to do this?
All right, so I'm just going to go over a couple things just to ground where we get our information from. I mean, a lot of this is going to be familiar to council. We're calling this the kind of the transportation ecosystem map, but it just kind of explains how we plan and build our transportation system, starting with the comprehensive plan and the transportation system plan, which Brian went into kind of in better detail before at the earlier part of this meeting. But what comes out of that are, especially the transportation plan, is we start to get the policy recommendations to implement code updates, our standards and specifications. It's all supposed to kind of gel together with the direction of the transportation system plan and the policies of the comprehensive plan. And then how we actually do it is all through, and we've had conversations across the board between what funding tools are we using to accomplish these goals, what are the projects, what are they trying to achieve in their budgets, what programs, what we talked about the transportation fee do we need to implement, and then obviously the ongoing operations and maintenance needs to make sure that our system stays in good working order. Next one. So when you go to the comprehensive plan and the transportation goals in chapter 7, which really come out of the TSP, this is where the engineers and the community, there's direct opposing forces that are going on in here. We are told to increase capacity, efficiency of roads, minimize congestion, but make sure roads are safe for all users, that we're getting roads and upgrading systems to get into targeted areas for growth, improve connectivity and route choices for commercial users, incorporate complete streets. So, and what the city's role, and especially the engineering and the transportation group, is we kind of have to put on that black and white striped shirt and play referee between all these different opposing ideas and comments. I'm sure if anyone's gone to an open house, we receive the myriad of comments from, why don't we add 6 more lanes, to why don't we have, close this off to cars completely, use it as a multimodal facility. And we're just trying to figure out what's the right balance of all that. And that's why we want to just come back and do a check-in with council on this topic, because this is where we start. We start with this, and then we go to council goals, go to the next one, that kind of guide what we're trying to do over the next couple of years. I won't go into all details of this. Keep going, one more. And then we have the playbooks for how we actually do this. So we look at what is the language of the project in the TSP? What is the language of the project in the GEO bond? What are engineering and standards and specs say around that? What are the development code requirements and Muni code requirements, which lay into how we create our CIP? And then we also have to layer on all the state laws that Brian kind of alluded to early and how we design a project. So we are always trying to figure out a way, is there a better way that we can communicate better with the public around this? Is there a better way that we can bring projects forward to council, or, provide additional clarity? Because it's all about level of refinement as we move down that project development type of process. So I'll turn this back over to Ryan.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. So to highlight, and I guess keeping this slide here in mind, we're now down at the capital project program level. We're trying to implement something that we've been directed to do for the last however many years you want to go back. So how we typically handle engagement as a city when it comes to our capital project is we'll get a consultant on board off the bat, because we have direction already that gives guidance such as build a low stress network, close missing sidewalk gaps, etc. And so we get a consultant on board and we evaluate what those high level goals are. And within that given framework, and hopefully within the given budget, we develop a few different alternatives for how that might be able to work. So it's possible, but it's hard sometimes to come at this as a blank slate, because if you come at this with a blank slate to say, well, what do you as a public want to see happen here? You're asking the questions that should have been asked and answered back up at the TSP level and at the policy level. So we're down here now at a project level. We got to get from point A to point B and implement something specific. So we try to develop some design alternatives that like I said, fit within the framework we're given and within the budget we're given. Then we go out to the public for our first open house. And this usually happens before, like right around maybe the 30% design. So still very early on in the process. Lots of ability to change and alter things. But we ask the question to the public, which one of these alternatives makes the most sense and why? Is there something we're missing as a city and as staff? Maybe something in the TSP did get missed and that the local and the folks that live on the street have a better sense of what has to happen there. So we go through that public outreach process, try to identify anything else. What we've been doing more lately is then we even come back to council again before we even proceed with any further design and say, this is the alternative we heard from the public. And this is what we think we need to build out there. Often with that, as I've noted a couple times before, comes a pretty significant change in budget. So we want to come to council early with that to say, this is what we believe we should build, but here's what the new price tag is going to be. So we usually get a council approval or action to be taken, and then our design team can proceed through 60% design and down the road. We typically go back out to the public again once we hit 60. And that's when we can get into some of the more detailed design efforts of what does this mean to somebody's specific property frontage? How are we going to avoid having to move a 6-foot high tall retaining wall? Or how are we going to avoid having to tear some trees down that we'd all like to see saved? So we get really into the weeds there with the adjacent property owners at 60%. And then we go to 90 and then typically have a final open house as we're finishing design before we put this thing out to bid for construction. And then ultimately we come back to council again for the award of the construction contract. So multiple touch points with the public and with the council just in the design portion of how we handle things. So I know there's been other ideas proposed in how we approach this. So that's another thing we want to offer up is if there's a better way for us to engage and do this, we're certainly open to how that might look.
We got a couple of recommendations at the end that we'll go.
Yeah. So just as a staff member, just to make sure it's clear though, that this is where that's why we as engineers want to solve riddles, right? Every one of these is a riddle. And so we hear often from the public that we need to design this to a higher level of standard than maybe what our current standards are telling us to do. That we're going to need more scope and more cost or more budget to get this done. Russ noted earlier, we often have conflicting comments of some person, somebody saying, well, my priority is my morning commute on my bike, and I want that to be as safe as possible. Well, somebody else's might be, I want as little impacts as I can have on the adjacent property owners because we want to keep the street narrow and we want to keep it slow. So we've got to try to balance those as best we can. And then, of course, all the public outreach, all the alternatives analysis, all of that just simply adds to the project schedule, which is fine as long as we can be transparent about that at the beginning. And we know that this is going to take longer. It could easily, that example I gave earlier, that could be at least a year, if not a year and a half's worth of effort just to get to a design that we can put out to bid. So adding extra touch points to council or to the public is not a problem at all. We just need to be realistic about the extra costs and the extra time related to that. And what's been happening a lot lately, because the running joke, as everybody knows, is if you've got a driver's license, that also means you're a certified transportation engineer, because we all use the system. So everybody's got an opinion on it, which is fine. But the worry is that we're going to fall into kind of this design by committee and that the public is actually designing what the improvement is. And that's great to get that public feedback. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure it's meeting certain standards for safety and reliability. I'm trying to balance everything Russ identified. And then we also have some really strong, passionate, wonderful advocacy groups here in town. And again, that can be an example of a direct conflict with an adjacent property owner who's we're trying to balance the effort of both of those. So this is what we experience as staff, what my poor project managers have to go through every day whenever they go out and try to engage and collect that feedback. And it makes it really hard to pull something together and to design something, knowing full well that there's a certain portion or percentage of the population that's not going to be happy with what we're doing.
So here's our recommendations, and you can click through because the little light bulb.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
So the first one is, just so council's aware, we're probably gonna bring a minor update, just the standard specs. It's more administrative, just to provide additional clarity on the city engineer's role, Ryan's role specifically in our approach to these projects and just where we can deviate from standards and where we can't. So it's more of a cleanup to the standards and specs. The second thing we wanted to see if there's interest from council, and because of time, what we can do is if there is interest, we could workshop it with staff and maybe bring it back to the next community building subcommittee with some ideas and concepts around this is, should we scope a larger community engagement effort on the standards and specs? Because what happens is we get into a project, we're on a corridor talking about a specific corridor, and we're getting questions that are much higher in terms of what we're trying to deal with and approach to bike infrastructure and the key route infrastructure. So should we look at maybe another engagement effort with the community to kind of take some of the pressure off of the projects, but also make sure that we're talking about this correctly, which could lead to some updates to our standards and specs now, or they also could lead to, because it depends on what's being asked and what our current policies are, they could be early inputs into when we update the transportation system plan in a couple of years, and they would be kind of broken out. But we're just trying to figure out, it seems like, because we keep hearing this large community conversation around our standards, and we're getting trapped in certain projects that have these more kind of global conversations. So we wanted to see if there's interest with council to kind of pursue that. And then the last question for you, and we can again bring ideas and concepts back, is do you want to look at another way to explore how we do the public involvement process with the community? One idea we've been talking about is, should we actually engage them early before we have design alternatives, just to talk about what the project scope is, the budget, the corridor, before we actually go to design alternatives. So there's some options we have there. We just want to make sure we hear from council. It's like, nope, keep the course. I think we're good. Or should we try to tweak some things? I'm going to stop here and just see where council's at, and then we can move on to speeds for the last 15 minutes. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. I think that's a helpful starting point. I feel like we are approaching this in a somewhat ham-fisted manner, in part because we recognize these conflicting values and then we try to balance them. And what I would like to do is see if there's an appetite to have a conversation around, rather than trying to balance these conflicting values, really arrange more of a hierarchy and prioritization of values. So I think what I hear is, in terms of the feedback of the process, is people are unsatisfied with the initial starting point, in part because of the implications of the standards and specs. Primarily, I think this is around speed. As we heard in January, when our police chief, Mike Krantz, presented to us about using automated enforcement, speed kills. And it's not just the posted speed, but it's the actual prevailing speed that matters. And I think he had cited some of these statistics. The vehicle speed at the time of impact is directly correlated to whether a person will live or die. A person hit by a car traveling at 35 miles per hour is 5 times more likely to die than a person hit by a car traveling at 20 miles per hour. And of course, if you consider that the victims might be children or might be elderly adults, those statistics are even greater. So I feel like what I hear is people are worried about prevailing speeds. And if you compare this to cities where there are no traffic-related deaths, mostly in Europe, the kind of ease and confidence that residents have when they walk out their front door to be able to explore their city outside of a car is liberating. It's incredible. And when I think about what we have here, we had 6 traffic fatalities last year. That's tied, according to my numbers anyway, tied for the highest number of deaths on our road system here in Bend over the last 20 years. And when we compare ourselves to the state, although our per capita numbers are pretty low, they are growing. Our proportion of people who die, whether they're walking or biking, is about double or sometimes 3 times what the state average is. So I think people have a real rational reason to be worried about the prevailing speeds. And what I would like to do is see is if there's an appetite to have a conversation around, do we have the right tools in our engineering toolbox, the standards and specs to actually bring some of those speeds down? Because what I hear a lot from staff is people will say, I don't feel safe crossing here. And a lot of times we hear, yeah, that's a tough one. I don't know what we can do about that. And it's not always related to funding. A lot of times it's the tools. So this is the conversation that I'd be interested in having about not, when we put that referee slide up there, I don't think it's a question of balancing. I think it's more a question of prioritizing.
But on this issue, I think your substantive concerns are, I totally hear you. I think what staff's looking for is like more clarity on the process and I think that substantive input is important for council to give, the public to give. But I think this might be a vehicle to get us to that, so that staff's getting the input at the right moment of, whether it's high level policy or project specific. The problem as I see it, the problem statement is that you're getting input at different levels and it is making, it is an inefficient way of managing input.
Yeah, we want to have a consistent conversation through the entire project.
We want to take aside all the substance of like speeds and specs. We want to have a kind of a common set of rules about when the city engineer is going to get input, what the role is going to be, and give an avenue to the public who is giving great input about street standards and specs, and maybe trying to channel some of that into a future transportation system update.
And I think you'll hear from the lawyers that the standards and specs is a good tool, because to the extent we're looking at public projects, we should also be looking at the standards for private projects, because we shouldn't have a two-tiered systems for different types of projects. And if we're looking at policy choices, whether it's speed, safety, it should be applied fairly throughout the city to different kinds of projects, not just our projects. So we would say process-wise, that would be a tool to look at it holistically, if that's a policy choice for council.
Yeah, and because we're almost at time, so I'm going to throw something out as a suggestion is because in theory, we're kind of off cycle in our subcommittee meetings. We could schedule another meeting in June, and Ashley can work with you to get another meeting scheduled, which we can go over speeds. The highlight of the speed conversation is obviously there's a lot of rules and standards and laws that are around that. Our best opportunity to look at speed right now, because on most of the existing corridors we have, if you want to reduce speeds, there's going to be physical improvements that are going to have to be built. And Ryan and David can go into that in much more detail, but we just can't arbitrarily go tell David, change speed limit signs and go put them up tomorrow. We'd have to actually change the physical environment to reduce the speeds in a way that where we want to get the impact. But we do have a great opportunity in all the corridors that we do have projects on to look at speeds, which I think is already part of the conversation that we have. So if the subcommittee's open to it, because we're not going to have time to do the speed conversation today, but it is a good topic to understand. But that's kind of like the summary of, yep, there are some things we can do, but we also need a lot of capital on existing streets to do something that would be effective and actually achieve the goal. But we could bring this conversation and kind of that public involvement conversation back with some recommendations on what we might be thinking about, how we would approach that at our next meeting.
Councilor Norris, any thoughts or?
Well, I'm fine with having that larger conversation. I mean, I think that's important on speeds, but my question is what are the noticing requirements right now for the public community engagement? Is it like a certain number of feet or from a project? Is there any sort of?
It's not like a planning land use application.
Yeah,
It's really.
it varies.
Open house.
Yeah, if it's a septic to sewer project that goes for a block, and it's on a local that's hidden away in a neighborhood, we're really just going to focus on the people that are impacted by that. If it's the Wilson corridor,
Right.
we're holding citywide open houses. We don't send a mailer or a door hanger to every house in the city of Bend. But if it's a corridor, if it's a Reed Market, a Wilson, a Butler, or any of those, we just try to broadcast through social media. We have a good public outreach efforts and hold multiple open houses and just try to virtual and in person now, post-COVID, and just try to do everything we can to spread the message as loudly as possible.
I guess from a staff perspective, we just wanted to check with council. Are you hearing and feeling the same thing that we're representing and what we're in terms of our staff? Like, what are you hearing from the public around our process and
No, I'm
feedback?
not hearing any of that.
I heard a little bit, I think we were at the Orchard neighborhood.
Yeah.
District meeting, and that's more in relation to Franklin, which I feel like we've been consistently hearing from a few handful of people. So yeah, I guess it would just be with me, you know, how are we noticing and are we doing enough in terms of increasing engagement?
Yeah, I hear, I mean, I think it's just project specific.
Yeah.
Yeah, Franklin's a good example of, we came up with an alternative post open house that was different than what we presented, and we're being fully transparent about that. And so, yeah, there's a whole nother round of engagement we need to take now before I tell our consultant to progress any further down the line. So we're meeting with the adjacent property owners. We're going out there with an arborist and our engineer and everybody to say, okay, what would this mean to you specifically?
Yeah. I guess I start getting concerned because of the delay and then the change orders to projects. And so that's where I start having a little bit.
It adds up.
So is it something where like you said, you do some more initial community engagement, but then 90% seems a little bit late in the project to me to kind of get input. So maybe it's more like, here's our main.
Yeah,
we have and.
Yeah.
It varies as you get closer. It becomes more informational than engagement. It's more of like, this is what we've done based on all of the things we've heard up to date. And at 90% or close to that, it's also an opportunity sometimes to bring our contractor in. So people can meet, this is the superintendent that you can go yell at when you're mad because you can't get out of your driveway. And they have a face that they can connect with on.
Here's the sketch, so here's the detours, here's how we're gonna phase the project, the impact of businesses. So what we're trying to figure out is like, how do we have this conversation where you're very general at the beginning and we get very specific? Because a lot of times we'll get to the 90% and that's where the feedback loop comes up. It's like, really, that should have been in the first discussion, right? Can't always avoid that, but we're trying to that's why we want to do a check-in with council, because from a staff perspective, it's really hard for the project engineers to say, what am I telling my consultants who have a very high bill rate? What am I telling them to do? And we're trying to figure out, is there a better way to kind of do that upfront process to say, here's the project scope, here's the budget, go design, and we kind of have more different way to have those upfront conversations than what we're doing
Why don't
now.
we try it? Why don't we try it with a project? Because I mean, I think the struggle I have at trying to put myself in your shoes is you go to council, you have a high level picture. If it's a bond project, you're going to TBOC. Then you're doing tons of public outreach. Then you're basically coming back to council at TBOC again, changes all again. This seems inefficient to me. And I think it would be worth some sort of pilot on one of these projects to look at. Here are the rules we're going to set out. Council's going to sign off from the beginning. We're going to hold ourselves to the same rules, right? And see what happens. Because I'm like, we all get sucked into the project level conversations like we did today on Greenwood.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a perfect example. And like, I just don't know that that's the best use of time and revenue.
No, and like even with Greenwood, we just want to make sure that because you're probably going to get questions on this. So we bring projects like, you're probably gonna get questions. So at least you get a little bit of background of, well, what are we trying to balance in all of this, right?
And if at the end of the day, the project's pretty similar for the user, like.
Yeah, that's it. And we also understand, because we're also trying to balance, like we hear, go as fast as you possibly can, get these improvements on the street.
Yeah.
And then we get stuck in this public involvement loop, which isn't bad. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just trying to balance, like, how can we, as you said, be the most efficient we can to get the projects moving and out the door.
That whole does not drive as fast as you can. I think I'm okay.
But that we can definitely, that's part of the project scope, is like everything we do has these principles. Right?
That holistic approach. And some of that stuff is policy, starting at the comp plan and the TSP, which then feeds the standards and specs. But I mean, you're right, Councilor Broadman, different projects, especially when we're talking about a built environment. Each project's going to have its own nuances and stakeholders. And I'm happy to come back another time and talk about speeds, but I mean, for example, if we were to try and push for changing speeds, there's the statutory limits. When you start getting down to design standards and changing design speeds, that is sight distance, it's braking distance, it's vertical curve criteria, horizontal radius curve criteria, that's a whole different playbook, I'll call it, versus for new construction, expansion areas and those things.
Which I assume would be the conversation that we have the opportunity to have when we take a look at the transportation system.
Yeah, the comp plan, TSP, these are definitely, in my opinion, conversations that help that hierarchy or decisions points, balances, maybe not the right word,
It's not.
but we are trying to serve all users.
Yes.
Well, the Wilson and Third, it looks great.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
So we'll, if the committee's good, work with Ashley, we'll try to see if we can get another meeting scheduled in the next month or so and continue this conversation and get us kind of back on our normal cadence.
And then I mean, I don't think we answered your three sort of life questions.
So I kind of heard head nods, like, we'll bring back the minor amendment for the standards and specs. That seems pretty simple. Is there interest in us looking at how to have a larger conversation around our standards with the community? Is there?
I think you're gonna get input about standards and specs. Let's have them go somewhere.
Yeah, that's what I kind of feel like. We can give them a venue.
Yeah,
and have a different type of conversation.
We're just about done with an annual update, and we parking lot quite a few from groups and interested parties that were directly related to our cross sections and street widths and curves.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great place to take that
Yeah, so
conversation.
we'll figure out how to scope that and what the resources might be for that. And then the third part of that was what we were just talking about. It's like, we can bring back a couple high level options on just public engagements, just as an FYI. I don't know, it's just to make sure, we want to make sure that we are balancing the need for speed as well as engagement and minimizing confusion and efficiency in that conversation.
Need for speed.
The need for speed to construct, to slow people down, how they actually drive on. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.